I haven't made a video in a few days. I was sort of busy with other things. And today I actually watched the Healing Voices movie because I pre-ordered it and I got it in my email this morning, so I watched it right away. And it was really well done, and I think watching it is a little bit of a turning point in a way, because I feel like I want to find other people to talk to who don't necessarily want to be pathologized or medicalized. And the main person in the movie is Oryx Cohen, and I didn't know much about him. And I don't really want to talk about what happens in the movie too much, because it's better to actually get it and watch it. Something that it reiterated in the beginning, and for me, it's going back to some of the stuff I talked about before, was that people who are part of the mainstream mental health system statistically die 25 years earlier than the rest of the population. And I was thinking to myself, like, I want those 25 years back, or I want those 25 years. I don't want to think right now that my life is half over. I want to think that it's 1/3 over, or maybe a quarter over even. And so part of what I want to create, a theme of that would be to get those 25 years back. And maybe part of that is by transcending the need for the mental health system. And they said the Hearing Voices movement is for people with lived experience of the mental health system, trauma, and extreme states of consciousness. And I would say I meet all three of those criteria. And Robert Whitaker is also in the movie, and he mentions listening to people in extreme states or in so-called psychosis. And a lot of my self-dialogue is to listen to and witness myself. And part of it is to unfold context from a place of wellness, instead of just waiting for a state where I feel I need someone to witness my distress, and usually that gets medicalized. I'm thinking it's possible that by witnessing myself unfold a lot of context for myself, and listen to myself and talk with myself, because I realize that not everyone has the time or context to listen to me and understand me, whereas I have both of those things. And I'm wondering if that will create a bit of an immunity to, if trouble ever arises again, which it likely will. I wonder if, just as the body can have inflammation, and that's sort of a sign of, I was talking about how the body can have inflammation, and that's a sign of injury. Maybe when one has information overload in the experience of map consciousness or trans consciousness, it's a sign of injury. It's like trying to reorganize information around a past trauma experience or a past something. And I was thinking about the movie Healing Voices and the title, and how by using my voice to talk to myself, it's like an attempt to heal my voice with my own voice. And I've talked about in the past how the ego is like our own voice turned against us, and this process of self-dialogue is actually my voice turned outward for me to see and listen to and experience as a mirror. So in a way, I'm healing my own voice with my own voice, as opposed to having my voice turned against me. And I don't want to say too much about the movie, even though if I ever do release this, it'll probably be long after the movie has come out anyway. But some of the things I thought of while watching the movie that weren't necessarily directly related to what the movie was saying was how it's not so much that these are biological disorders, but they're almost like Gaiac reordering in consciousness. I feel like it's a Gaiac phenomenon. It's from Gaia, not really an individual human being. And it's attempting to integrate us with Gaia, and that's why this consciousness comes in and introduces us to the mysteries of consciousness and sort of the laws of consciousness, and how the laws of consciousness are different from the rules of the ego game of society that society's created. And it's almost like this energy gives us a glimpse of that mystery and a glimpse of how things actually work. And then we come back to consensus reality, and I feel like it's up to us in a way to still act based upon some of these other laws of consciousness that we may have experienced. And it's even showing us that consciousness is a mystery, whereas the ego is in a habitual pattern thinking that it has everything figured out. It's like it's giving some of us a glimpse and then wondering, well, what will they do with this glimpse that I just gave them? And unfortunately, when we experience this glimpse, we might experience supposed symptomatic behaviors because we're glimpsing into the laws of consciousness that aren't in accordance with the laws of the ego society. So we're going to be incongruent, where our body is existing in this realm, this order of society, and then our consciousness is looking at this other realm. Our consciousness perspective, the aperture zooms out and we have a view from an expanded perspective, and so we're operating and acting from this expanded perspective, not the limited ego perspective. And when that happens, our limited ego that people think that we are, that they know us to be, starts acting differently, aka symptoms. But really the symptoms are of trans consciousness. And some people, I feel, have this trans conscious experience where they can sometimes spontaneously go into these other states. And people desire these other states and put themselves there through chemical means of other types of drugs and things. There are many ways to go to that state, and only a certain amount of people who go to those states actually get diagnosed with a supposed mental illness. But it's pretty much a normal experience for that to happen through whatever means. And so it really shows that it's almost like consciousness is trying to break free of this prison of the ego society that's been designed, because it wants to move towards complexity. And I feel like map consciousness and trans consciousness is an act of consciousness on consciousness attempting to free itself. It's a movement in consciousness to push away one's individual programming, to move them into alignment with the collective consciousness that we all share. And since it's shared, it can kind of go anywhere. It doesn't have the same limits. It doesn't experience time the same way. And it seems like it's only a temporary release from that prison of egoic consciousness. But I feel like when I think about it that way, map consciousness and trans consciousness is actually an act of compassion. Consciousness being compassionate towards itself in a way. And then the test is that will people in egoic consciousness receive this act of compassion by consciousness, in consciousness, with compassion? Consciousness is altering supposed personal consciousness away from egocentricity towards world centricity. And then when people come back, they're not facilitated and supported towards that. They're pathologized and called mentally ill, like they need to go back to who they were. And so consciousness is also doing this in the form of autism. It's knocking out that egoic consciousness. It's preventing it from taking hold at that young age. And it's not to say that people who experience that part of the spectrum of consciousness don't develop any sort of ego. It's just that it's not of the same type of the supposedly normal trajectory of ego development. It's almost delaying that more, so then the child can play longer and play in that pattern recognition, learning in a different way other than verbalization state of consciousness for longer, and develop much needed capacities that we probably aren't really aware of. And I feel like the same thing is happening for people who go into map consciousness and trans consciousness. And part of it has to do, I feel, with complexity. So as the biodiversity decreases on Earth, as we destroy species and ecosystems and environments and nature and rivers and cut down all the trees, all this complexity is disappearing, and we're having a greater and greater population of human beings. So it only makes sense that that sort of lost complexity needs to be transferred into humanity, and that's being seen with the expressions of different genders and different intelligences and different consciousness and so many different expressions. That complexity needs to go somewhere. And I feel like part of that complexity is increasing images in the mental domain. So much more of our world is becoming mental. It's about mental stimulation until we basically barely know that the world is there around us and will be taken in by virtual reality at some point, and it might have already actually happened, and we're just not really aware of it. But what I mean is, as more and more complexity is going towards this inner image making faculty to sort of appease ourselves with images as opposed to acting in the moment, the complexity is sort of going into the mental domain. So then it's possible that some of us are being drawn into that because that's sort of where the complexity is going. And I have no idea if that's true, but I've just recently become a little fascinated with complexity and entropy and thermodynamics. And again, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm just sort of wondering and curious about these things and how they relate. They did talk in the movie about something just briefly around emotional responses to our natural environment, in terms of people who have certain propensities to be a bit more emotional And the thing that I thought was an interesting point to note was that we're not really in a natural environment. So it's saying emotional responses to our natural environment. Well, our environment's so unnatural, it's so artificial, and that's part of the trouble with consciousness, is sort of so detached from nature in the form of human beings. And nature is partly there for us to enjoy and be in awe of and in a state of wonder. I was looking out my window and there's these birds and they're just sort of eating something off this sad looking dried up bush or tree or something, and shaking the snow off, and I don't even know what they were really eating, but it was these fat little birds, and I just was sort of struck by what a miracle it was that these birds were there. And I also remember having an experience that we are the birds, like our consciousness goes into the birds at night or something. It was really weird, and I don't really know how that really works, but so I think that's a key, to say an emotional response to unnatural environments and so much unnatural stuff that's happening, not even just about nature, but about ultimate human nature that is underneath all these programs that we've been given, these mind viruses. So if one is sort of emotional and perceiving in the moment, one gets fed epimemetically things to say and actions to do. I think I talked about epigesturetics. In a way, it's like the perception feeds the gesture in the moment, as opposed to precognition or cognition and thinking about things before we act. It's fed based on our perception, and our perception is based on our level of consciousness as well. And map consciousness gets us in touch with those inner human dimensions that, until that point, have been largely mysterious to us. And those inner human dimensions, those are mysterious. Those are the mystery. And we cover that up with my story, my ego consciousness, me, my, mine, I, and all that. And then we don't experience ourselves and our lives as a mystery, because we've already wrote the story. We've already decided who we are and what life means. And I don't know if I've said it this way before, but I feel like the scariness that happens in map consciousness, it eventually becomes scary, even if it starts out beautiful and wonderful and rich and all that. It's almost like it's a way for us to come back to consensus reality, because if it kept going like that, it would be very difficult to actually reconnect with reality. We would no longer really have the perceptual apparatus to even see and experience this consensus reality. We'd be so deprogrammed from it. So it's almost like we can only go so far for so long, and so much further away from the level of collective consciousness of humanity before we sort of have to snap back. But in the meantime, we still do change the fabric of reality ever so slightly. So it's almost like being an explorer of consciousness and exploring the inner domains of consciousness. And so consciousness is trying to expand itself through us, trying to increase its complexity. And that's not just through chaos. It has to actually coalesce into some kind of intelligence system for that complexity to be realized in a way. just like a cell had to be created, which is, it's not random. And I was seeing again through watching the movie that I don't want to as much focus on my experiences in the mental health system, but what my experiences are pointing to and meaning on a greater whole. And by creating this context and changing the meaning of those experiences, at least for myself, then the other part naturally falls away. The need for the system perhaps falls away. It's like, what are the messages pointing to?